Good afternoon, folks, and welcome. My name is Marvin Overby. I'm an affiliate faculty member here at the University of University of Missouri. I used to be at the University of Oklahoma before Keith was at the University of Oklahoma. But we are very pleased to welcome today a good friend of the University of Missouri and of the Kinder Institute, Keith Gaddy, at the University of Oklahoma. We have put him through his paces today. This is his third presentation he's done. He started this morning a presentation on residential colleges, just talked to our graduate students about publication in the social sciences, and so he's really doing really yeoman's duty for us today. Keith and I have been friends for longer than either one of us care to admit. We have talked a lot, we have drunk together a lot, we have eaten good meals together, and it's really a pleasure to have him back here at Mizzou. Keith is a very prolific author. He has published some 40 articles in various political science journals, really across the discipline. He's best known for his work in Southern politics and areas like redistricting and gerrymandering, but he also has a piece in the Journal of Conflict Resolution, right? He has also published, what did we decide the number of books was, 14?
14 titles in 24 volumes.
Yeah. And that doesn't include the novel he's written and books he's written on OU football and University of Georgia football. So truly something of a Renaissance man. He gets up, he tells me, every morning about 4 o'clock, which I think I would be more productive if I got up that early too, but I don't have the stamina Keith has. Keith's most recent book is this 2016 volume called The Rise and Fall of the Voting Rights Act, which he wrote with his graduate mentor, Chuck Bullock at the University of Georgia, and a younger faculty member at the University of Oklahoma named Justin Wirt. I would highly recommend it to you. I've assigned it for the students in my Southern Politics class sitting in the back. They're reading this. It's probably the best one-volume treatment of the history of the Voting Rights Act that's out there, and I highly recommend it to you. I'm not sure how much he's going to refer to this book today in the talk. He is coming here today to talk to us about a topic related to the Voting Rights Act, but more broadly, and that's this issue of gerrymandering. He added the question mark in parentheses after we had put out the initial call about this. So I'm not sure exactly what the question mark is, but I assume Keith will tell us that as we go along. So friends, please welcome my friend Keith Gaddy.
Good afternoon, and it's always good to be back in Columbia, Missouri. It's always good to see my good friend Marvin Overby and also my Justin. Did I have you for class in the master's program or undergrad?
I think it was the master's program.
Yeah.
It was the class on Congress.
Yes, Justin Dyer here at the Kinder Institute, and my old friend James Sendersby and others here at Mizzou. It's good to be here. Anytime I can get anywhere near SEC football, I'm usually happy. So, and this is as close as I can get without having to go to Fayetteville. So, I'm going to explain why the question mark landed on there, in part because this is as much storytelling about, in a way this becomes storytelling about career choices, but mainly I'm here to talk because of an amicus brief that Bernie Groffman and I wrote and signed off on that's in front of the Supreme Court right now. As many of you may know, there's been a little bit of controversy up in the state called Wisconsin over its redistricting, and there was a challenge in federal district court last year, which led a 3-judge panel to overturn the state legislative districts of Wisconsin as an unconstitutional partisan gerrymander. Now, this is an exceptional decision by the courts for a variety of reasons, and we'll get into that in just a minute. At this point, this is one of those, garment rending moments. In addition to being an academic, I spent 13 years as a litigation consultant in voting rights and redistricting cases. And I used to tell people walking in, no matter who your devil is in politics, whether you're from the left or the right, I've probably worked with them at some point in time, okay? No matter who your demon is, I probably worked with them at some point in time. And I did data work in both 2002 and again in 2010, 2011, 2012, and expert testimony work for the Wisconsin legislature. Okay, and part of my job was to provide data services, measures, evaluation, and feedback regarding the legality of their maps, especially in the area of voting rights. Okay, there are two principal threats states have always looked at when they attempt to craft a representative map where they fear they may get sued and have their maps thrown out. One is that they've diluted minority representation or engaged in racial gerrymandering, and they're going to have their maps thrown out as either not satisfying the Voting Rights Act of 1965 or violating the 14th Amendment on the use of race as a criterion, okay? So race as an issue could cut two ways. The other concern is, do we deal with population deviations in a manner that we ensured one person, one vote? These are always the two big challenges that had to be dealt with. So what happens is every state in the country, when they get started in this area, they call in some expertise, data expertise, and we come in and we provide them with data analytics, measures, and we give them feedback also. And so, for example, in Wisconsin, I was asked, in Milwaukee, will our majority black districts perform? And if so, are they overpacked? Do we consider race too much in creating African American opportunity in Milwaukee County? Will our Hispanic districts allow the Hispanic electorate to access the process and elect candidates of choice? Did we sufficiently address that, or have we considered Hispanicity too much in crafting those districts? And there are some statistical analyses we can do and evaluations we do that gives feedback to the client, okay? One of the things we also do is we develop measures of partisanship, okay? Because oftentimes we end up going to court over maps. Maybe a legislature and a governor can't come to an agreement on what a map should look like. Maybe there is litigation over an aspect of a map. And one of the questions comes up in this process is, in crafting a remedy, in crafting a new map, have we put too heavy of a partisan thumb on the scales when we draw the map? Well, in order to assess that, we have to have partisan data. We have to have data about partisanship to evaluate partisanship. So one thing that happens in every state is they assemble those data. They may or may not use them in the process of crafting the map, but they assemble it and they have it, okay? Because if you get into litigation and you end up in a remediation phase where you have to revise a map, you have to go back and check this thing. So one thing that we have always done when we've gone into states to do data assembly and data work is either the state has already provided partisanship data or we assemble that for them. And then we attempt to build the best possible measures of partisanship, measures that have both validity and reliability. I did this in Wisconsin, relying upon what was basically, and for the grad students in the room, this is going to sound radical, a precinct level database using weighted least squares regression with 5 predictor variables, okay? That was it. That was the entire model. 5 prior elections, 1 outcome, and an incumbency control. Okay, 6 predictor variables for a 6-year period. And we took these data and compared them to an index used by the state of Wisconsin and discovered that no matter how we measured partisanship, we got the same thing. The federal court pointed to these data and the use of these data by the state of Wisconsin as evidence of partisan intent. And it's one of the pieces of evidence used by the courts to reject the Wisconsin map, okay? And at this point in time, by the time this happened, I had gotten out of this business for about 4 years, okay? I made some health decisions and some professional decisions, and I wanted to do other things. So after 2012, I said, okay, this has been fun consulting. I'm going to do other stuff and have a lot more fun. I'm going to write about football, right? Build things, build beautiful things. But then Wisconsin gets sued again, and they lose in federal court, and they appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. I get a call from a colleague of mine, Bernie Groffman at Cal Irvine, and he asked the question, Keith, you had said that if we had the opportunity to submit an amicus in a partisan redistricting case, that you'd like to join it. Well, here's what I'm imagining. Let's work on this. And so we worked with some lawyers and we crafted a 3-pronged test for identifying and measuring partisan gerrymanders. In the process of doing so, we made an assertion, and this assertion flies in the face of existing precedent, sort of, which is we argued the partisan gerrymanders need to be justiciable, that it needs to be possible to go to court and litigate over a partisan gerrymander. Because for the last 15 years, you haven't been able to. There was a case out of Pennsylvania called the Vaith case, in which we had a split opinion, a 4-1-4 opinion, that's not quite controlling, but sort of is, wherein Justice Scalia writes an opinion saying, partisan gerrymanders are non-justiciable, the court shouldn't look at it, this is merely the purview of politics. So Scalia is attempting to take a step back and get us out of that political thicket that Justice Frankfurter complained that we had thrown ourselves into in 1962, okay? But the 5th vote to not overturn the map in Pennsylvania came from Justice Kennedy, who concurred with the result of the decision, but didn't necessarily agree that partisan gerrymanders were or were not justiciable. He left open to being persuaded, left himself open to persuasion. And for the last 15 years, people have been working on an effort to persuade one man in the country, Tony Kennedy, that partisan gerrymanders are justiciable, that you can put into place a standard to measure them, that you can create a legal theory to carry a challenge, and that the court should intercede against partisan gerrymandering. And now a case has arrived there. Cases on partisan gerrymandering make it to the High Court about once a generation. If you go back before the Vaith case, you have to go back a previous 20 years, back to Bandamer out of Indiana, which set a standard that partisan gerrymanders were justiciable, but set an evidentiary standard so impossibly high it can never be satisfied, which was that a gerrymander should be so egregious and so damning to the disadvantaged party that it precludes any opportunity to participate in the political process whatsoever. That basically, if you have a partisan gerrymander that's unconstitutional, it completely wipes out all the Democrats in Indiana, for lack of a better way to put it. Okay? So that kind of lays the background of where we are. Okay? The reason I bring this up is that I'm going to speak to this as a public-facing academic for a minute. One of the things you have to get used to in doing this is you have to have a thick skin, because you're going to get a lot of criticism. And I think there are people in Wisconsin who probably would shoot me if they had the opportunity, okay? Because I am the son of a bitch who gerrymandered their state, in their opinion. And then there are people on the right who would shoot me because I'm that son of a bitch that threw the Republicans under the bus with my amicus, just being honest with you. You get used to that and then you let it go, and you step back to the intellectual question. And the question is, can you measure gerrymanders? How should you measure them? And can the courts render verdicts on gerrymanders? And my belief is, yes, they are justiciable. Yeah, there are tests that can be applied. And these tests should be applied in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and also in other states where litigation is pending or underway or possible, Maryland, Illinois, for example. Okay. So let's get started. My hope is to take about 20, 25 minutes to walk through the balance of my remarks and then throw it open to questions. And I'm going to prepare yourself for something, which is we're going to do a talk about redistricting and gerrymandering with no maps, okay? There are no maps in this presentation. There are no graphics, there are no figures, there are no visuals. I'm it, okay? Gerrymandering has been, okay, let's start with the definition. Gerrymandering is the act of crafting legislative boundaries for political advantage, okay? That's what gerrymandering is, the act of crafting legislative boundaries for political advantage. And it takes a variety of forms. Most of these are bad, sometimes they're necessary though, okay? And gerrymandering has gotten a bad name for a reason, because as a general rule, what gerrymandering is supposed to do is it's supposed to preclude variation in preferences in the public from being realized in the form of representation. Let's start with that. That's supposed to be the consequence of gerrymandering, is those who gerrymander do so to prevent themselves from feeling the detrimental consequences of the choices of the public. Okay. The most common form of gerrymandering is the population gerrymander, okay? This has been unconstitutional for a half century. The one-person, one-vote cases in the 1960s threw out the notion that where you live should dictate the power of your vote. So if you were to go and look, for example, at the legislature of the state of Georgia in 1962, you would discover that the smallest county in the state, and there are 159 counties in Georgia, the smallest county, which was Tolliver County, Crawfordville, which had a population of about 700 people, had one representative in the state legislature. The largest county in the state, Fulton County, which had a population at that point in time of probably about 400,000, had 3 representatives. Okay? The 8 largest counties in the state each had 3 representatives. The next 30 largest had 2 each. And then the 121 remaining had 1 each. What this meant, though, is that with about 12.5% of the vote, you could win a majority of the legislature. Where you live dictated the power and value of your vote. And a wave of litigation that follows Baker v. Carr, and especially the Reynolds v. Sims decision, leads to the nationwide application of a standard of one person, one vote. And what it does is results in this wholesale shift of political representation away from rural areas and into suburbs and cities, with a requirement that population deviations have to hit a range of about 10 points around average, and even those deviations have to be justified by some neutral public policy. Okay? So one thing we do as background in redistricting is we equalize population in districts. But that doesn't get rid of gerrymandering. Okay? You can still have a rural advantage gerrymander where you take rural areas and you stretch their districts into suburban areas to scoop up enough voters to be a minority of the district, but leave control among the block voting rural voters. It's called the rural stretch, okay? And districts that do this are often referred as bacon strips because they got these narrow stretches that go in and pick up suburban and urban communities who get representatives who are from way out in the country and don't represent their interests, which leads to a latent dilution of the representation for these other areas. That particular gerrymander is still perfectly constitutional because the populations are equalized. Second type of gerrymander that we know a good deal about, and one that we talk about in Rise and Fall of the Voting Rights Act, is the racial gerrymander. Bad racial gerrymandering is when you undertake an effort to dilute minority voting, okay, either by cracking a minority electorate among several districts where the minority electorate cannot coalesce and elect a representative of choice. The other form is through packing, where you pack as many voters of a racial or ethnic minority into a district as possible to minimize their impact outside that district. So if you need a 60% black electorate to guarantee the election of a representative of choice in a district, and you pack that district up to 80 points, you're diluting and minimizing the impact of the black vote in other constituencies, okay? Both of these practices are evidence of racial discrimination in the districting process. You have to take care to avoid both, okay? Now, it's with the efforts to satisfy a very proactive implementation of the Voting Rights Act in the 1990s that we get the beginnings of weird-looking districts. So you get, was the Salamander in North Carolina, Marvin?
No.
No.
The I-80.
Yeah, the I-80 district in North Carolina, which at one point is only about as wide, I-85 district. It's only about as wide as the interstate. One incumbent congressman observed that if you tried to drive through the district, open the doors of the car, you'd kill everybody living in it, okay? So you get these long, narrow districts, or you get districts that take disparate communities and link them together with little tendrils. In Pennsylvania, they have one, it's what the Donald Duck Kicking Goofy district that they describe that starts in Lancaster County, makes its way to Harrisburg, and then heads up towards Happy Valley. Okay, so you get these really odd shapes that are contorted in such a manner. It starts with the effort to accommodate majority-minority districts on a proactive basis while also protecting Democratic congressional incumbents in the South. We have tortured machinations in the shaping of districts. The districts look odd. Then we get into the Supreme Court. The court looks down and says, you know, and this starts in North Carolina. They look down in the Shaw case, they say, this is one area where looks matter. And this district could have only been shaped this way if you were thinking predominantly about race. There were other ways to meet your obligation under the Voting Rights Act and not do this. We're throwing your districts out. North Carolina has yet to make it through a redistricting cycle since 1992 without having at least one map thrown out by the courts. Usually two, sometimes three, and they're constantly in court. I mean, if you want to have constant employment, be an election law lawyer in Durham, okay? You're gonna have work. You're gonna have work. You're gonna have things to do. Okay. Then we've got the third gerrymander, the partisan gerrymander. It's the one that we were always permitted to do on some level. The assumption in the partisan gerrymander was that there is a spoils of war that exists in redistricting. And one thing we political scientists have known for ages is, depending upon how you draw a district, you're more likely to get a gerrymander. One party control of the legislature and of the governor and no commission, you're going to get a gerrymander, okay? You're going to get either extreme or marginal advantage for the majority party beyond what you'd expect out of a traditional seats votes curve, the traditional distortion of a one-party, one-vote system, a single-member district system. The best thing to get a fair map is to either go to court and have a federal court do it, or to have divided government. But the thing is, with divided government, you end up with a different type of gerrymander, one that isn't partisan in nature, which is the bipartisan incumbent gerrymander, where you try and protect all the incumbents, keep everything frozen in place, hope for marginal gains, win back the governorship, then take control of the process later. Okay? Back to the partisan gerrymander, though. It used to be the partisan gerrymanders were rare. You go back, if you were to go to California about 35 years ago, you'd find this infamous map called the Phil Burton map. And it had some tortured shapes to it. And Burton had done remarkable things. He had split up counties needlessly and split up some cities. And he was using voting precincts as a building block because it was the first major redistricting to use a geographic information system, a computer-assisted map drawing. And we should have seen the future then. Then in the 1990s, GIS technology costs came down and mapping systems were disseminated beyond the states into the hands of political parties, political action groups, civil rights organizations, even individual candidates. So more and more people can make maps. And the computing speed gets faster, the data gets more refined. And we get to the point by 2002 where we're working with census blocks, the smallest building block available, as our building block for drawing districts. We can draw them in a relatively efficient fashion by hand. And now we're at the point where we can actually run tens of thousands of simulations relatively quickly and generate many, many permutations of various maps if we wanted to. Okay? And the impression has been created in the public that somehow this is what happens, that the RNC has some guy sitting at a supercomputer, or I guess like Al Gore reinventing a government lab coat or something, generating all these maps and then coming in the door and looking at Republican or Democratic lawmakers and saying, here's your Frankenstein monster, this is what you should implement as law. Then there's the practical reality, which is that there are a couple of hundred politicians involved in the process and they have particular preferences, which begins with their own desire to get reelected and their own desire to not build new constituency relationships. Okay? So even in a state where we're going to pursue a partisan gerrymander, at least for the majority party, incumbency is going to have a big impact as an input on what the map's going to look like. Okay, it's something to remember. The other thing we run into is the fact that the knowledge that really counts is from actual expertise on the ground. I won't say what state it was, but I was in a state once where they were working on a remap. It wasn't Wisconsin. And they had these two political experts they were using in a back room to draw districts. And they've got this beautiful, beautiful Apple server and these huge monitors. And they're just churning all this data and they're crafting these maps. And I look over their shoulder and I said, okay, this funny bump here, what are you doing here? And this guy was a longtime political consultant in a major urban area. And he said, oh, that's a Representative Langmeyer. His ex-wife lives on that side of the line. His girlfriend lives there. And so we need to keep this particular split in place, okay? There was another guy who, I know of a Chicago congressman who absolutely insisted he had to have the zoo and the airport in his district, okay? Okay, I think, yeah. So you never know what people are going to prefer. There was a Texas congressman who he had to have every donor in Harris County who had ever given to his campaign. Every member of the Bush family had to be in his district. His predecessor, Bill Archer, had to be in the district. Rice University had to be in the district so he could keep an eye on them. But every person who had ever made a fortune in oil and gas had to be in the district. So you get all these odd requests. But the fact is that we can do a better job now of identifying where the partisanship is, how to draw highly partisan districts and engage in partisan gerrymandering because the environment is so politically polarized. The vote correlation from the national level to the local level in the United States has not been this partisan structured since the Gilded Age. It's incredible how partisan our politics are. You tell me how you voted for most any election, I can tell you how you probably voted for most every election. This makes the crafting of districts a relatively easy proposition for partisan advantage. If you just know something about the political geography of your state and how communities voted, you know how they voted for everything. And you can start drawing maps. The other thing is we have a variety of stylistic indicators that we don't need to put into data, the so-called micro-targeting data. We don't need to have these data to craft districts, but we can craft districts based upon party just by looking at them. You have a university in your city? Yeah, you probably got a bunch of Democrats, okay? Bill Bishop, you ever heard of him, the journalist from Texas, wrote a book called The Big Sort? Yeah. Yeah. Bill and I are both from Louisville, Kentucky. And Bill talked about the importance of local culture and local tradition. And in Louisville, one of the things, you meet somebody from Louisville, you don't know them, you ask them one question, you look at them and say, where'd you go to high school? And it tells you everything you need to know about them. You know their socioeconomics, you know probably where they went to college, you know where they shopped, you know who their friends are, you know what kind of car they drove. Because the city is segmented in that fashion, okay? Bill said that the closer houses are together, the more likely people are to vote Democratic. The further apart houses are, the more likely they are to vote Republican. And this one little bit of spatial knowledge, and the bigger a house is, the more likely someone is to vote Republican. This one little bit of knowledge can carry you a long way. If you're building new subdivisions, it's probably going to be disproportionately full of Republican voters, right? If you go into a neighborhood and the houses have been painted an array of various colors, especially in Austin, you found a bunch of Democrats, okay? But you don't need that stuff. All you need is a little bit of partisanship data. We have fast computers. We have a very easy way to start drawing maps to partisan advantage. Okay. So the technology facilitates this, but the technology was adequate 10 years ago, it was adequate 15 years ago. Now it's just really, really fast. But that doesn't mean it's unconstitutional, right? It doesn't mean it's illegal. It could just be spoils of war. So why should we be able to adjudicate these things? Why should they be justiciable? Why should we be challenging gerrymanders in court? Well, I'm going to argue to you that part of it just starts with American democracy. And any of you who have ever read an American government textbook, and I'm going to assume that if you're an undergraduate in the room, if you're in this room now doing this, you probably took AP government, right? The odds are pretty good. Or you came here and took it as an honors section, or you passed it pretty quickly. But at the beginning of that book, at the front end, you read about something about American democracy and American culture. And there are 6 assumptions that my colleague Tom Dye and I make in our book about what are the assumptions of American democracy. I'm going to go ahead and assert these to you right now. One of these is simply individual dignity, right? That the individual has some degree of sovereignty that's been imbued in them by providence or God or whatever, and this dignity manifests as freedom, okay? This is part of the foundation of those values articulated by Jefferson, articulated by Madison, all the early founders, all the early framers, right? Second is this notion of equality. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean the equality of economic outcome, right? But it does mean equality under the law. It does mean an equal opportunity to do a thing based upon your means and ability, right? That you won't be precluded from engaging in a market transaction by virtue of your race, creed, color, or national origin. If you are here, you are an American, you will have that equality of opportunity. It may not manifest in terms of an outcome, but it exists. Participation in decision making. That in a democracy, the citizens will have the opportunity to participate in their government. And we do this explicitly, right? Even if we look at the vote as being a negative right, a right that when we look at the design of the Constitution is articulated as the circumstances under which the government can't deny it to you. You have that right to participate through elections. You may offer your opinion. The First Amendment contains a lot of this. Not because it was given to you there, but merely because it was articulated there. That these were things that were so important that they had to be articulated and put beyond politics. You always had them, but we wanted to make sure it was said out loud. Majority rule and one person, one vote. That my vote should not be worth more or less based upon where I live inside my jurisdiction, right? And that majorities in politics should be able to translate themselves into majorities in government, right? Especially sustainable, stable majorities. That if a majority emerges, you should have an electoral system that allows it to govern. This is where we're kind of in our mess right now. And then finally, 2 more. Responsiveness to changing preferences. That if the voters determine they don't like the way the incumbent government is going, they have the opportunity to change it. And that should they express a desire for that change, change will follow. Now, one of the cool things about we electoral political scientists is we study systems, we see how systems either help or distort this. For those of us that study US elections, single-member district elections, congressional and state legislative elections, there's that whole incumbency thing that really messes with everything, that whole personal constituency issue. But still, we expect responsiveness in the system, okay? Then finally, one last thing. It's important. Political freedom. That ability to actually express your political will, to express the unpopular opinion, okay? To associate, and have association have consequence. Okay, these are the ideals. These are the ideals. This is what we aspire to. Then there's the reality of where we get hung up. But out of these foundational assumptions of American democracy, and there may be more, okay? Your mileage may vary. We see that gerrymandering undermines democracy based upon these assumptions. It undermines democracy based upon these assumptions about American democracy. We're crafting electoral districts for political gain. And in particular, what's happening is a majority party is attempting to put into place a representation system that inoculates themselves against a loss of popular support. They're attempting to hinder the minority party from gaining political power. So by definition, they're attempting to impede responsiveness and minimize the impact of the voice of the disadvantaged party in the redistricting in terms of translating their votes into seats. It's a pretty straightforward proposition. As it stands, we view that as spoils of war. Spoils of war, it's politics. After 30 years of mucking around with redistricting and thinking about it, I'm convinced that partisan gerrymandering needs to be taken up by the courts and that we need a test. So how would that manifest? What we're going to do is, Professor Groffman and I have advanced one test. There will be others, okay? We have no idea if we're going to make the opinion in the Supreme Court or in the Pennsylvania Commonwealth Court. We certainly hope to. But there are three parts to it. And the first one is what we call partisan asymmetry. Partisan asymmetry. And I'm going to go over here to the sideboard real quick and just show this to you as a quick visual. Got the big props out. Any of you who are old enough to remember chalk talk, get ready, because here we go, okay? Partisan symmetry does not mean proportional representation, okay? A proportional system would look like this, that if you had votes and you had seats that went from 0 to 100%, you'd have a 45-degree line, okay? And right here at 0.5, there'd be an intersect, and the majority would get seats in proportion to its votes. One of the things we know about single-member district systems is that there is a distortion that occurs, and there's a small seat bonus that exists for a majority party under a fairly drawn map. And it manifests in greater or lesser, let's assume that that's a symmetrical balanced S-curve for the moment. It manifests as a symmetrical balanced S-curve where the majority of the vote will translate into the majority of seats. And to the extent that there is any seat vote bonus, it's going to be the same for either party, okay? So if Republicans in Wisconsin got 53% of the vote and got 70% of the seats, we'd expect to see the same thing for Democrats. And if we had a 6-point shift in the popular vote in Wisconsin, the lion's share of the seats would go to Democrats, because under a symmetrical map, you'd have a lot of highly competitive seats and a lot of volatility. Here's the problem that exists in the Wisconsin map, is that there's still a curve, but that curve has a floor for the Democrats. And then it's got a severe ceiling, okay? So the lower the curve, the more seats the Democrats have, the higher the curve, the more seats the Republicans have. And part of what happens is, at 50% of the vote, the majority party is far exceeding expected performance. They reach a high plateau of seats relatively quickly at about 53% of the vote, and then they just stay there. And then there are a sizable minority of seats locked in for the disadvantaged party. But you have to get down here to about 43% of the vote. And then what happens is the Republican Party just falls off a cliff and falls into oblivion in the state of Wisconsin. At the rate things are going, something that actually could happen up in the Badger State, I don't know, okay? This is symmetrical. This is not, okay? So one of the things we expect in a non-gerrymandered map is that we'll have symmetry. We'll have a response curve that looks something like this, with a 50-50 break point. If we have an unfair map, we're going to expect to see a plateau, a trough, a steep cliff, and a really, really solid lock-in of the majority of seats for the party that drew the map, and it's not responsive to most partisan tides. And this gets to the second part of the test. Is the map responsive to shifts in public sentiment and public support? So if you have a substantial shift in the vote preference in the state from one party, away from one party towards the other, do seats follow? Now the reason this matters is if you've got responsiveness, this means you've got a political solution to the gerrymander, right? If it was possible that maybe instead of getting to 50% of the vote to get the majority, the Democrats have to get to 52, well, that's within reach, okay? That's within reach. And that means they can get a majority, they can run a map, they can undo the gerrymander. You have a political solution. This notion of the absence of political solutions also exists in racial redistricting cases that are litigated in front of the court. It's part of the rationale for the Voting Rights Act that no political solution exists to the problems of racial discrimination. It's part of the one-person, one-vote cases as well. In the Baker v. Carr case, in Tennessee, the state had no popular initiative available to the electorate to fix malapportionment. Only the legislature could fix apportionment, and the legislature was malapportioned. Therefore, the public had to come somewhere else seeking relief, so they came to the courts. So if we've got asymmetry, and we have non-responsiveness, the last thing we have to ask ourselves is, in the words of it's fitting we're in Missouri, words of Mark Twain in Huckleberry Finn, was they made or did they just happen, right? We stood on our back and looked up the stars and we pondered, was they made or did they just happen? Well, that's the critical question here, which is causation. Was these districts made or did they just happen? And the answer is critical, because if they were made that way, and they were made that way with intent, with an intent to disadvantage a party, to discriminate against an entire class of voters on the basis of their partisanship, now we've satisfied the test. It's a willful act, okay? Now the question you're asking me is, how do you prove intent? Well, there are some direct ways and some indirect ways. The direct way is to look at the record. Statements by lawmakers, statements by map makers, correspondence in the process. That party was being considered, it was being considered with the express purpose of minimizing the impact of the disadvantaged party in politics. That's one source of evidence. When we go to the voting rights cases, we look for expressions of racial discrimination, willful intent to dilute the minority vote. So we're applying the same kind of test there in terms of evidence. But the other thing we can do is we can actually look at other actions in the map-making process. And of all things, the court has been aware for a while of how to measure these things. Back in 2004, there was a case out of Georgia called Cox v. Larios. And in that case, the state of Georgia had their state legislative districts thrown out by the federal courts as a one-person, one-vote, on a one-person, one-vote violation, on an equal population violation. And the problem in Georgia was twofold. For about 8 years, Democrats in Georgia have been winning 60% of the seats in both legislative chambers based upon about 43% of the vote. Okay? They had pretty much locked in a legislative majority even as they dwindled to superminority status in the state throughout the 1990s and into the 21st century. Second part that was interesting is the population deviations in those districts were almost completely structured by party. All the Republican districts were plus 4.9% population. All the Democratic districts were minus 4.9% from the average. So your typical Republican district had about 15% more voters in it than your typical Democratic district, which minimized the impact of Republican voters turning out elsewhere. So one thing you can do is you can look at the application and the relaxation of what we call the neutral redistricting criteria: compactness, treatment of political subdivisions, population deviation structure, in structuring partisanship. So you can flip the causality on its head in this particular example. The other thing you can do, though, is you can look at how incumbents get treated. In that Georgia map, nearly every Democratic lawmaker seeking re-election had their own seat. Over half of the Republican caucus in the State House and the State Senate was paired up with 1, 2, sometimes 3 other lawmakers of their party, or put in a district that they had no prospect of winning. And Georgia has what they call a run where you stand law, which is that you have to have lived in your district for a year before the filing deadline. Well, if you redistrict 3 months before the filing deadline, kind of hard to pivot and preserve your incumbency. So in the process, they not only constantly kept double and triple decimating the Republican caucus, they also kept knocking out any continuity in their caucus, okay? You kept bumping off their incumbents, you kept bumping off their ability to build a stable, sustained party organization. Federal courts threw this out, Supreme Court sustained it. And of all things, Justice Stevens, joined by Justice Breyer, argued that this case showed that a gerrymander was discernible to the judicial eye, that social science had a variety of tools that could measure gerrymanders. So the treatment of incumbents, the willful treatment of them, the affecting of partisan purpose, this is where we find causation. Well, now we're left with the last dilemma, and I'm still searching for the answer to this one, which is a theory. Do you have a good legal theory to sustain all this? That's what we don't know. Okay? If we were to look at racial gerrymandering, if we were to look at one person, one vote, Article 1, 14th Amendment afford us an easy, plain vehicle for understanding how equal protection applies, okay? Partisanship gets thorny, okay? And a couple of weeks ago, they were arguing in the Pennsylvania Commonwealth Supreme Court on the appeal of the decision of a district court to throw out Pennsylvania's congressional districts. And a lawyer named Mark Braden, who's a fine lawyer, I've worked with him before, stands up and says, partisanship is too unstable to be considered as a political class, okay? That partisanship shifts, people change their partisanship through time. Your existence as an individual, your racial identity, your ethnic identity, who you are, that doesn't change, okay? But partisanship does. And people might split their tickets and people change their vote from election to election, right? See, I used to buy this argument. And on its face, it's persuasive that partisanship has volatility in it. But the era of polarization has brought remarkable stability in the vote. How you vote up the ticket tends to be how you vote down the ticket. To the extent you split your ticket, it's mainly because you like your incumbent, right? And so I'll still go vote for Tom Cole all the time because I happen to get along with him, my Republican incumbent congressman. Even as I'm voting for every other Democrat up and down the ballot and the occasional Libertarian, I'm still voting for Tom Cole. How does this fit in? Well, consider this. If you've used partisanship data to shape your districts, and you do so in part to inoculate yourself against the volatility of the electorate, the fact that vote preferences shift. This means that the assumption of the instability of partisan identification is endogenous to your act. You've assumed this as background noise. You're attempting to isolate yourself from one of the manifest characteristics of partisanship, which is that it's stable for 80% of the electorate and unstable for 20% of it. So you've assumed partisanship, and what you're trying to do is inoculate yourself against people who are not necessarily strong partisans, but people who vacillate, to ensure that if you capture their vote once, you get to keep it forever, or you're otherwise immune from the influence of them changing their preference, okay? You're defying the need for responsiveness in a representative democracy. and you're doing so based upon classes of people. And I think that's how you get there. Most of these arguments that are being made right now are based upon the First Amendment or based upon equal protection under the 14th Amendment. And I have no idea how the court's going to respond to them. This is not really what I do, okay? But this is where I've landed. And I'm curious to get feedback from you all about that idea, because this is going to be the critical factor in seeing how the court acts and what Justice Kennedy does. He's always seen the empirics. He just needed a solid legal theory to attach the empirics to. So we'll all sit around for the next 4 months waiting with bated breath. Okay. Tell you what I want to do is I want to throw it open to questions at this point, and I appreciate your patience. Where should we get started?
Yeah, let me tell people we're recording this, so don't just shout out questions. Let me come around and give you the microphone to speak into. Okay. Professor J. Dow.
So Keith, that was a great talk, and I really enjoyed it. But I want to explore a little bit more why you hate Felix Frankfurter.
Well, I don't mean to sell him short, okay?
The political thicket is an interesting benchmark, and you're right. We have not been able to bring these cases to the court for a variety. It's the last part of that thicket that still exists. But I'm going to begin with just an observation that every test we know about for gerrymandering contains some gray areas in it. There are no bright line tests. So the unbiasedness, yes, that's a bright line test. But what's the optimal level of responsiveness? I mean, what do we think is proper? And you and I might disagree. Causality, that's a pretty. You have to make a convincing argument. So now I go to the courts, and I would argue that most of the time when the courts hear cases, stare decisis applies. They rule in a very predictable manner with past history. But as you get closer to political cases, especially partisan cases, the court seems to not rule in a way that would suggest partisanship never enters the equation. Think of Bush v. Gore. Think of McConnell versus FEC. All of these cases are heavily partisan cases, and the court comes out with what many people, especially in Bush v. Gore, would say, well, that's a partisan ruling, right? So isn't this argument of letting the courts handle the gerrymandering cases, what makes you think that the court's not going to look at these in a partisan eye and do the worst thing possible, give their stamp of approval to districtings that the justices like because of their politics, as opposed to, and they're going to have the gray room in these tests that they can make a convincing argument. The responsiveness isn't right. The causal mechanism appears a little bit off.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. I mean, yes. If we dig into this a little further, here's something to consider. Most challenges should fail. Okay? One of the things we know about voting rights cases, challenges brought under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, where the burden of proof is on the plaintiff, most of those challenges fail. They don't succeed. Okay? To the extent that they do succeed, they're disproportionately in just a few states. And they're mainly in Texas, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and South Carolina. In other words, they're in the Deep South, plus Texas. So most of the time, efforts to challenge racial gerrymandering and racial discrimination in voting rights fail as well, often because some aspect of the prong, including their aspect of causality, which would be the totality of circumstances text, ends up failing, okay? So it wouldn't surprise me to see that this gray area and setting a high bar makes it difficult. But there are really only two options left. And one is to go through the amending process of state constitutions to attempt to compel the creation of commissions. And the other one's to go to court. These are the options that are available to the public right now. And in some states, we don't even have access to initiative petition, right? If we tried to do this in Tennessee, we wouldn't get anywhere. The opportunity simply doesn't exist. I would point to Florida as a success case. Florida ran a thing called State Question 5 and State Question 6 a few years back. They didn't put in a commission, but they put in a set of explicit redistricting standards for state legislative and congressional seats. And they put it back in judicial review on this through the state Supreme Court. And Florida has had districts tossed, not all districts, but select districts tossed because they disproportionately considered incumbency or disproportionately considered party. So there are vehicles for change that exist, But if we've gotten to the point where we must engage this and have this conversation, in part because I think that the relationship between partisanship and identity has changed in this country. And we need to think about this as being manifest in terms of those other first principles that shape who we are. We at least need to have that conversation. Will the justice be a partisan? Of course. There's a reason everybody's trying to rush this thing up to get it to Kennedy, right? The hope is you get it on there, you get Kennedy on board, Roberts comes along to join the opinion so that it's 6-3 and he has control of the opinion, right? And you get a mediated standard that's systematic but highly demanding. Then Kennedy goes off the court, and then hopefully you don't get a justice who comes along and says, stare decisis is good for 1 year, and then we flip the decision again. And then we have a cycling problem. And that's the big concern here with these representation cases is we don't want to end up with a cycling problem. We've had one on race that we're still trying to extract ourselves from. We could end up with another one here. I think it's a valid criticism, yeah. Yes, sir. Wait for the mic. Yeah.
Jay Castleworth.
Thanks. Terrific talk. Really, I'm learning a lot here. So you talked about of course, the difficulties in a lot of legal challenges is in showing intent, and you've also talked about the development of technology, right? And that can be very useful in planning your maps. It also, of course, enables us to have computers draw maps for us, right? And so what I'm wondering is, that seems to me to be a sort of appealing way that I might inoculate myself against claims of partisan intent, is to sort of rig an algorithm just so to produce the results I want but maintain plausible deniability, right? So I'm wondering, maybe this is something that's already happened or been challenged, but what would you think the implication of that would be for this sort of jurisprudence in the future?
This is where I think technology is really going to be the key to bringing this down. And if you look, we have a variety of scholars. We won't get into every citation right now. But one of the things we can do is we can basically run simulations of maps and generate 10,000 maps, reduce them down to a set of abstract measures, right? Compactness, partisanship, racial opportunities, all this stuff. And then we can compare the map that was actually crafted, which it ought to show up somewhere. It ought to happen at some point, okay? It's like, what is it, the 5,000 monkeys in a room for infinity will produce a work of Shakespeare, right? So let's suppose we did that, and there was a distribution of districts from most Democratic to most Republican, right? If we discover that the actual map as created has a very low probability of occurring, and there's no other plausible explanation for its having been produced, we have a strong sense that intent is at work. We have a strong sense of causation, right? Yeah. So again, I think the technology actually can help out in this instance because we can use it as a forensic tool. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Marvin?
Well, I'm walking now. I'm going to ask a
Well,
question.
you missed one back here.
Oh, did I? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, walk right past you. Sorry.
Yeah.
So you talk a lot about polarization and the relationship kind of with gerrymandering. So could you just maybe explain why you think the country has become so gerrymandered, or not gerrymandered, so polarized?
Hell if I know, but it's mean out there. No, I don't mean to be glib. It's I'm going to try and give this to you briefly, and I'm going to engage in some sweeping generalizations, which is the death of the New Deal coalition and the economic foundation that made it possible has been supplanted by a politics of weaponizing identity. And this comes, in my opinion, initially from the right, and then comes from the left. And we're on a race to the bottom, and the right has been racing there faster. And what have we done? We weaponized evangelical Christianity for political advantage, okay? And we weaponized rural identity, and we weaponized nationalism, right? And we weaponized against immigration. And we kept trying to find, on the right, we kept trying to find these others. And we kept othering people. And we started talking about voting as a privilege rather than a right, and the assumption that if somebody was brown, if brown, then immigrant, than illegal, right? And we talked about the need for ballot security, and we talked about the need for voter photo ID and proving who you are. And we kept feeding this beast of division. And we have talk radio that helps feed it, and the internet helps feed it. And everybody can find their way to the thing they're upset about. And on the left, we drill into the assumption that somehow beyond race, where we have special protections that are explicitly articulated in the Constitution, that any form of identity constitutes a protected class. And all of this has to be considered, and that we must compel change in the economy through levers that come from social justice, levers that I'm sympathetic to. Nonetheless, this creates division, okay? I'm not saying both sides do it. I think the right has got a lot more to be held accountable for than the left, okay? I think the weaponized form of evangelical Christianity has been especially detrimental to constructive discourse in the United States. But it's been a downward spiral where we went from being able to disagree constructively to disagreeing, to refusing to cooperate, to willfully attempting to undermine. And it's led to attack to the legitimacy of our institutions, and it's eroding the foundation of our democracy. We have to find those things that bind us together and build around those. My problem is I can't give you a solution because I'm an old Sam Nunn Democrat, okay? Which means I have no party. But I think it is this feeder of identity politics. But the reason identity politics happens is that we don't have respect for difference, okay? How you worship God is your business. How you worship God in your place of worship is your business. Who you love is your business. How you select your gender identity is your business. And I have to respect that in the public space because of that first principle of democracy, individual dignity. We've gotten away from the notion that people are entitled to individual dignity because we've weaponized against the nature of their identity. We've done it from all directions. And that's where we have to go to seek redemption from this. Here into the sermon. But
So to kind of follow up
yeah,
with that, though,
sure.
do you think gerrymandering has played a role in that increased polarization in the sense that with safe seats, you're seeing more of a race in the primaries, which you have to pander to that base and it becomes more and more extreme?
Yeah, I like that theory a lot. I like that theory a great deal. And the other thing that happened is you had a loss of meaningful competition. State legislative competition is drying up in the United States because the seats are so safe, especially in the South. You can have a majority of seats go off uncontested by one party or the other, simply because there's no prospect for change. And this allows a fragment in the primary, a faction in the primary, to completely dominate all politics. V.O. Key said this was what was wrong with Southern politics back in the day, that you had a tiny constrained electorate in the Democratic primary that dominated everything, and you'd have often your most extreme faction dominating those politics. I mean, the fact is, it's a shame the Southern politics kids left because they knew V.O. Key lives. And unfortunately, we're living in his universe again. And it's because of this thing, a broadened electorate where more people can participate is part of how we overcome this, because the middle's been chased from the field in politics. Now again, I don't have evidence on this. I just took 25 years of political science literature, summed it up, and then put my own political spin on it, okay? But yeah, that's what I believe. That's the way I see it from standing here. And I think that gerrymandering contributes to it. I don't think it created it. I think if you go back and read Bill Bishop's Big Sort, we started choosing to be birds of a feather and to basically kind of coagulate together in certain places based upon wanting to be around people who are like us. And in a university town, that means we want to be around witty, interesting people, right? We want a good life. And we don't care who people are or what they look like. We just want them to be interesting, okay? And good food. Okay.
Two questions. I'll try to keep it short. The first is about democratic theory, and as you're looking at this, and how essential is it that parties are actually representing majorities who elect them and their interests and preferences? So it seems like an essential part of the theory is that the majorities electing a party or identifying a partisan ID actually have their preferences translated into governance in some way by that party. So it gets into maybe the empirical question: do we know that happens? Are parties well representing the people who elect them? And then the second question unrelated to that is, how much do we care about, or why should we care about intent? Shouldn't effect be enough?
Okay. As to the first question, I don't know. Because depending on who you talk to about whether or not parties are engaged in effective representation, who they purport to represent, we've never been good at having responsible parties in the United States. You go back to 1952, you got the American Political Science Association report on the state of the parties. And in that report, we get this call: we need ideologically defined responsible parties, right? That's what the report says. That, this idea of having these Southern Democrats and these Yankee liberals and these labor types and everybody all together in one big broad tent, you're not getting anything meaningful out of that, right? You got Truman. That's about all you got. You got Truman, okay? My favorite president, okay? But you got Truman, okay? For a moment, I'd forgotten I was standing in Missouri until I said that. Okay. And then what happens 50 years later, 45 years later? We have ideologically defined parties. The Republicans run on a national platform, contract with America. They purport to implement it. We get increasingly ideologically defined politics. We have stark polarization on policy preferences that are driven by partisanship, right? The best example being the Affordable Care Act. A lot of Republicans like the idea behind the ACA. It was a Republican idea in 1994. Then when it became Obamacare, they hated it, right? So to a certain extent, those policy preferences are being dictated by how we man up in terms of party. The reason I say this is now we have ideologically defined parties, and they pursue clear policy agendas. We have a current administration in Washington that has pursued the congressional agenda that's been there for decades on tax cuts and tax reform. And we have an executive agenda which is underway through executive implementation. And you know what? What are the political scientists saying now? Polarization's terrible. This partisanship is killing us. Ideologically driven, stark choices in public policy are bad for democracy and bad for our republic, and we need to find a way to build coalitions and compromise in the legislative process. Everybody wants Sam Nunn back, right? I like Sam, good man, miss him, wish he'd come back. So yeah, I think it's possible. I do think it's possible. I don't know what Robert Dahl would say. We'll leave that to him to express himself. Second part of the question was? Intent, yeah. I'm going to go back to the voting rights to engage this, which is, I think intent does matter because it's permissible to get a distortive effect through a naturally designed constituency, okay? So for example, we know that in Wisconsin, there's always going to be a small advantage in the map to Republicans, and there's always going to be a small responsiveness cliff, okay? The Democrats really do have to hit about 52, 53% to get a majority, but there's a reason why. Milwaukee is the second most racially segregated city in the United States. The African American and Hispanic population in that city are more segregated than in any city except Detroit. That means you got a large number of Democratic votes that are clustered there in the northern half of Milwaukee County and just south of the river also in the Hispanic community. The second thing is, you remember I was talking about all those smart, witty people who like good food earlier? Yeah, they're all in Madison. Madison was 85% Democratic. And it sits in between two lakes on a set of peninsulas. Madison is simply a tough nut to crack when you draw representative districts. You're going to have to run some really safe Democratic districts there. Meanwhile, the Republican vote that spreads out over the countryside has a lot of marginal geographic advantage. It's really hard to crack the Republican vote in northern Wisconsin, western Wisconsin. The place where you could have the most success doing it is probably down near Janeville, maybe. And that's, and the only reason that congressional seat stays Democratic is because Paul Ryan's in it, right? So part of it is if the background noise, for lack of a better way to put it, if the background radiation of politics shows a small advantage, you might detect what looks like a gerrymander because of lack of responsiveness and because of bias, okay, or lack of symmetry. But it might just be there naturally. So we have to take that into account. But the other thing is we're talking about things, we are asking for the act of government to rise to a level of a constitutional violation. And historically, in most arenas, this has required a demonstration of intent, that we have acted willfully to do this thing. Now, mind you, we're offering mighty thin evidence of intent in this test. I readily concede that. But it's really hard to gerrymander and not show intent. And it could be that the absence of any information is part of the indication, which is, if you look at the North Carolina redistricting, Tom Hoffler came in, the big Republican redistricting guru. He helped mastermind those maps. He swept in, helped North Carolina make their maps and left no paper trail. No evidence whatsoever of his presence other than a bill. Okay? Now then, Justice Berger observed in talking about campaign finance that sunshine really is the best antiseptic, okay? That if you want to cure the ills of campaign finance, you just make sure that everybody knows where everybody's getting their money from, right? And maybe what you do is actually put big patches on lawmakers' uniforms like NASCAR suits, okay? And we know who was bought by Coke Industries, okay? But if we keep an open record of redistricting and we keep the activity in the open, if we require by law a documented process, that's how you can keep track of everything. And if you refuse to keep track of that, you could argue the lack of any discernible paper trail, any testimony trail, any evidence of hearings, a secretive process. A secretive process shall be pursued to be prima facie evidence of intent given the presence of these other biases. Okay? That's how you get there. But I think you have to have something in there, if only to protect legislatures from needless litigation over maps that are merely the product of the natural politics of their geography. Justin, I'm sorry, that was a long answer. There won't be a quiz today, though, so that's the good news. But any other questions, folks?
I'll ask a question from my colleague, James Endersby.
Yeah.
We're doing a book on some important congressional elections, and as an expert on gerrymandering, do you have an opinion about whether Madison versus Monroe in 1789 was a gerrymandered district or not?
I have no idea.
Ah, okay. All right.
Show me the map. So we have one more question up here, Marlon.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
This may be kind of an out there question. Historically, I can understand why districts were determined by geography, but do we still really need that today? And if we didn't, if we opened it up to other methods of determining just districts, would that help or hurt?
There are some really cool things that can be done, okay? And if we go, we could do things with blended systems where we could have a mix of geographic representation and then bonus seats for vote performance, right? And this has been floated for the American case for a while. If you were, okay, who's a doctoral student in the room? Okay, there's a classic work by James Sundquist that he did in the 1980s on constitutional reform for the U.S. polity. And he made an argument for some ways that you could sort of Europeanize the American Congress. And one was to give bonus seats to the party winning the majority of the overall vote for Congress nationwide to ensure they had sufficient seats to be the majority in the House. Another one was to take former presidents and put them in the U.S. Senate as senators for life. Okay. Now I'm just trying to imagine Ronald Reagan in the Senate. That would have been fun. Or Bill Clinton. Anyhow, enough about Bill. But yeah, there are novel things we could do. Multi-member districts, going back to multi-member districts is a good idea. In the states where we have bicameral legislatures that were created in part to accommodate the need to represent geography in at least one chamber, maybe keeping a second chamber but making it PR and tying it to the vote for governor and running a list system. We could do this. There are a variety of things we could do. I mean, we've used at-large congressional elections in the U.S. before. It's only due to federal statute that we don't now. We could do things to have more responsive system with broader and different models of representation. We just choose not to. Because We're Americans. And by gosh, land. Land. We represent from the land. That's what we do. We might get there someday. But, majority vote systems would help. I think California, Louisiana jungle primary system's a really good idea. I think it works well. Second choice voting, ranked choice voting. Basically the entire laundry list of everything that Rob Ritchie is posting over at Project Fair Vote. All this is stuff we ought to be trying out. 91,000 governments in the United States. We have a laboratory. We can experiment with these things. We can try. And we may end up back where we started before, which is where our papaws were, right? Which is all of our farms together in a single district. We vote for that guy, and by gosh, we hope he brings home the pork. All righty. Anything else? Got one more in back, Marvin.
One more. We'll make this the last question.
I will say, I'm running out of punchlines here. We need to nail this one down. You guys have been great today, and I do appreciate it. Thank you.
What can we do about this? It's an issue, but where do we go from here with this information? What can I do? And then as a follow-up question, how do you not be cynical, when it seems you can be so small in a big system?
Well, let's start with the second part first. We'll come back to what can you do in a minute. How can you keep from being cynical and being so small in a big system? There are 7 billion people on this planet, and you're one of them. We're all small. It's okay. It's all right. I'm not saying that condescend to you at all. We're all small, and it's all right. You recognize there are things in this life that are bigger than politics, and you use politics as a shield to protect yourself and your individuality and the rights of yourself and others, okay? What you don't do is you don't use politics as a cudgel to beat down others. And you reach down in your heart and you become forgiving of your enemy. Because he's not really your enemy, he's merely your opponent. Okay, that's just what I think. In terms of what can you do, well, participation is the only solution. Finding vehicles to motivate the change you want to have. If that means getting behind an initiative to demand a redistricting commission in your state, you do that. If it means running to attempt to win, or mobilizing voters to win to affect change through the legislature, you do that. But what you recognize is that it's going to come at a cost. And that this really is active citizenship, and government is either something that you can do or it's something that can be done to you. Okay? And I elect for a more active form. But you have to take advantage of the available tools. Right now, the only active available tool that has the broadest impact is litigation. We may discover we're completely frustrated. So then you attempt to affect change in legislatures. Here's one thing you could propose. One solution is you go for a federal constitutional amendment that amends Article 1 to require the use of commissions in states to draw congressional districts. You could amend the Constitution to require a periodic adjustment of the size of the U.S. House to ensure that we have smaller constituencies. We're averaging about 795,000 people per district right now, which is way too big. If we were to use a cube rule estimate of how big Congress should be, it should have 676 members. And someone will say, "Oh, that's too big." The same size as the House of Commons, okay? And they meet in a room not much bigger than this one, okay? Even though, as you all learned this morning, I got blown up a few years back. But yeah, that's what you do. You affect change through sophisticated vehicles. And if you don't think you can, consider this. Back in the 1980s, an undergraduate in a government class at the University of Texas discovered that there was an amendment to the Constitution that had been laying dormant for nearly 200 years. He wrote a paper, which he got an F on, arguing that you could reactivate
got a C.
it was a C. You could reactivate this amendment and get it ratified and amend the Constitution. And what this amendment did, it was part of the original Bill of Rights proposal, held that no member of Congress shall enjoy the benefit of a pay raise that they voted on until after re-election. Yeah. It's now part of the Constitution. The guy got a C. Did they ever change his grade?
To an A+.
As well they should, right? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Keith. We have put you through the ringer today, so thank you very much for your time.
Oh, my pleasure.